Welcome to January and November here at Roosevelt University and the wonderful city of Chicago. I'm Chuck Middleton. I have the privilege of being the president of Roosevelt University and welcoming you here briefly to this amazing evening that we're all getting ready to experience together. Thinking about the overarching theme of the evening, it's about collaboration, it's about doing things as communities to make it better for everybody in the community and for all that the community teaches. And I really learned that personally about 40 years ago when at another institution a group of women faculty members came and said they were going to create a women's studies program. But the powers that be had no interest in that and wasn't even sure that was a legitimate thing to talk about or to study. So they had subversively decided that what they would do is use the curriculum by cross-listing the courses they were already teaching. They just weren't calling them that. And out of that emerged a women's studies program that ultimately, 20 years later, when I was the dean of the college, we created as a women's studies department and we hired our own full-time faculty for it. And in that process, what I learned was it was the collaborative spirit and the commitment to each other and to the values and ideals that everybody believed in that made it such a powerful experience. And tonight, I think we're going to have yet another example of how that is a truthful statement across many walks of life and across many issues. So I want to welcome all of you here, and I particularly want to welcome all the panelists here who are going to be introduced to you in just a moment. And thank you all very much for being here and for giving us at Roosevelt an opportunity to learn from you and to work with you in these ideas of freedom and justice, which matter very deeply to all of us. So let's get going. Welcome to Roosevelt, and I would like to introduce my colleague, another president here in Illinois, Susan Pinking, who is going to come up and going to do the substantive work in just a moment. She's president of Shimer College, a wonderful institution with liberal learning at its heart and soul and core. Susan.
And that is what an ally looks like. So it is my pleasure to welcome everyone on behalf of Shimer and to utter the following sentences, which I hope you'll find both entertaining and serious, which is always the goal of Shimer. First, though, let me utter my own thanks on behalf of Shimer, both personal and professional, to Betty Bayer, who's right here to my, whichever this is, my left or my right, in no perspective, whose commitment to the life of the mind and to feminism exemplifies what I believe is the best of leadership, both within and beyond institutions. Without her, tonight's event would not happen. She joined, as some of you will know, the board of the National Women's Hall of Fame, which is in Seneca Falls, New York, as a nearby resident in Geneva, but is a person who brings both global, international, and local love of the importance of equality and freedom to the table. She also brings a whole array of her friends and her connections. And I'm also grateful to Jill Tietjen, the president of the board of the National Women's Hall of Fame, who has spent an entire day in Chicago reminding us of our role in history. I want to offer a welcome that also includes a challenge. It's rooted in more than 160 years of history at Shimer College. Shimer was founded by two women, Frances Wood Shimer and Cinderella Gregory Lansing. For some reason, we usually use Frances Wood's married name and Cinderella Gregory's single name. I don't know why. They came from upstate New York to the wilderness of Illinois in 1853. My challenge is thus rooted in Thorstein Veblen's concept, one that I believe describes Shimer as well as tonight's event, the privilege of historical backwardness. Because we're rooted in history and know it, we're able to move forward with resilience and hope. Because we know Roosevelt is Franklin and Eleanor, right? We know the value of education, both within colleges and beyond, and at other venues such as museums and the National Women's Hall of Fame. Through those venues, through the value of education, we imagine and make a future that is, as we say at Shimer, dangerously optimistic. Frances and Cinderella exemplified a notion that would come to the fore more than 100 years after them: sisterhood. They worked, they played, they thought together. They exemplified alliance and dialogue. for they were neither the same. One was an administrator and the other one, weirdly enough, a teacher. They were neither the same nor only different. They managed and led, they built institutions and sustained them. They led, they learned, and they did it together. Sisterhood is indeed powerful. Their sisterhood had a legacy for the educated, for example, Mary Ann Nursing, who co-founded with 7 other women a women's college in China. Sisterhood is global. Of course, I should probably say there was a guy involved, his name was Henry Scheimer, but we ignored him. Alliances across sameness and difference matter. Of course, Frances Wood Scheimer and Cinderella Gregory Lansing are not with us tonight, except in spirit. As the first woman president since Frances, sisterhood is, indeed, as one of tonight's panelists has put it, interrupted. And yet, most importantly, sisterhood is. Today, we know we need to manage and lead, to hope and struggle, to move forward together and with our allies. Sisterhood is reborn and reborn and reborn. At Scheimer, we have a song about the phoenix rising, and it's not only because we stole that phoenix imagery from the University of Chicago. Tonight, I'm thrilled for Scheimer and personally to participate in this rising of the phoenix that recognizes and is women's leadership, that builds a new world upon that foundation, that builds a new alliance of Scheimer and Roosevelt. I'm thrilled to help us remember and remember in both senses the great conversation that is the conversation of women. Thanks to Betty, and thanks to our panelists, who will tonight move that conversation forward as long as we all listen and speak and bring our voices to the table. It's a privilege. Welcome on behalf of Scheimer College.
Welcome. Thank you, Susan, and thank you, Chuck. Good evening and welcome to all of you. We're very happy to see this audience on a chilly night, and we know that you love the warmth of debate and discussion, so we think that's what draws people in. I'd like to welcome you to our forum entitled, Does Equality Ask Us to Settle for Less? I'm Betty Bair, Professor of Women's Studies at Hobart and William Smith Colleges in upstate New York. Here in Chicago, hanging out at the University of Chicago for a while. That's always fun. And I'm also a member of the board of the National Women's Hall of Fame. And I just want to say a few words and put the framework before you for our panel, and then I'm just going to throw out some small questions to our panelists after I introduce them. And then we will have them speak to the questions, explore them a bit. We'll open it up then to the floor for further discussion, and then we'll return for some closing remarks from our panelists. It's especially wonderful to be here tonight at Roosevelt University for so many reasons. And I want to thank President Charles Middleton for co-sponsoring this event with the National Women's Hall of Fame, Scheimer College, and my home institution. There is a good synchronicity here tonight. And I do not say this lightly, because the Michigan of Roosevelt that stands for equality, justice, and freedom is the same mission that we hold dear at the National Women's Hall of Fame. This is a project at the National Women's Hall of Fame is about education, as it is also at Roosevelt. But also, Eleanor Roosevelt, for whom Roosevelt was named, one of the Roosevelts, was inducted into the Women's Hall of Fame in 1973. She was one of the first class of inductees. And beside her in 1973, as one of the inductees, was Elizabeth Cady Stanton. And so there's a beautiful circle there that brings us to the question of equality. Elizabeth Cady Stanton is very special to Seneca Falls and to the Women's Hall of Fame because, depending on how you write the history, many of us believe that when she read the Declaration of Sentiments on that hot July morning in upstate New York, and no doubt humid as well, in 1848, she was reading a declaration, a charter for us as women to think about not just equality, not just joining in the conversation, but building the vision, building the country in which we live. So she covered that conversation in a page, a declaration, and it began like this. It was modeled on the Declaration of Independence. And let me just read you some of the first words. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men and all women are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, that to secure these rights, governments are instituted, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed. That brings us to liberation. That brings equality, arm in arm with the conversation on liberation. In 1948, Eleanor Roosevelt, well known for the United Nations Declaration of Human Rights, begins this way. All human beings are born free and equal in dignity and rights. They are endowed with reason and conscience and should act towards one another in a spirit of brotherhood. The 1970s brought us the debate about the Equal Rights Amendment, and in that debate, they returned to a document penned in the 1920s and also read in Seneca Falls, New York. And that was the Lucretia Mott Amendment. And it was an amendment that said, we are all equal, created equal, and we have equal responsibility and equal representation and equal participation. So, those are the thoughts that were running through my head when I started to think about these panels. And I was wondering, with all the talk that we have of equality, where we see in the newspaper that women are earning perhaps 1 more cent this year, so we're up to 77 cents on the dollar. It's been a slow, long haul for me, I just want to say. And I'm looking at my retirement and I'm thinking, is that going to be 78 cents or am I going to make 79? I'm listening to many of the other statistics, and not to sideline us with the downside, but this is the way my brain works. In 2011, women represent 40% of the world's labor force, but 1% of the world's wealth. Women account for more than half of the world's university students. Very educated, but very underpaid. After more than 30 years of women's increasing participation as faculty, as professors, in American colleges and universities, the American Association of University Professors says our salary disadvantage has not eased one bit. Fewer women are at the higher ranks than their male counterparts, and those at the higher ranks make 90% of what men make in higher education. Yes, it does make me look at my male colleagues differently. From 2008 to 2013, fewer women won Oscar awards than the historical average. A recent report on women in literary arts has evidenced a couple of turnarounds in the literary representation of women in prominent book reviews, but there's still a lack of diversity and representation. In the Atlantic Monthly in 2003, for example, 32% of the content was by women, and in The Nation, it was 27%. Looking at the 1%, women currently hold 4.8% of Fortune 500 CEO positions and 5.1% of Fortune 1000 CEO positions. 1 in 3 American women, 42 million women, plus 28 million children either live in poverty or are right on the brink of it. That's the Shriver report. Women hold 18.5 seats in U.S. Congress. I think that's come up a little bit with the recent election. 20% of the seats in the Senate and 18.2% of seats in the House of Representatives. Now, I read you these statistics because when we receive them from the media, they're often presented to us out of context, so that we're told it's up 2% or 3% or 1%. But I want to know over how many years am I to measure this increase? What is the frame of reference? Is it 1848? Is it 1648? What is the starting point to think about our equality? So that brings us to some of the questions for tonight. We've been circling this central term of equality in what has been called the longest revolution, or as some term it today, the stalled revolution, or to borrow from 2 of our panelists, slouching toward equality, or the title of one of our panelists' recent papers, second wave, tidal wave, or barely a ripple. So this is the question before our panel tonight. What are we talking about when we talk about equality? And what happened to our conversation on liberation, to our conversation about our vision and how to build the world, or revolution? We've been told equality is out of reach because of failures of confidence or failures to lean in. We've been told that things are getting better despite the slow, barely discernible movement. And if we count that from 1848, that's 166 years to work out the details. So, tonight, we join a long history of what I like to think of as troublemakers. Those who trouble our conventional ways of thinking, talking, and making change. And we're going to trouble what others claim too. That is, that the revolution in women's rights is over. We won, and we're just kind of cleaning up some of those details. This is why many of us return to Seneca Falls. This is why many of us see it's important to have institutions such as the National Women's Hall of Fame, the DuSable Museum, the op-ed work that Deborah Siegel does, and also women's studies. This is why we make the commitments to these institutions. We are from different institutions, but we share partnerships in education and in social change. Allow me to introduce our panel. And I'm going to do that by alphabetical order. With us tonight, we have a very distinguished panel. We have Carol Adams. I would like to introduce her first. She's a PhD sociologist, and she's featured in the oral history collection, The History Makers. Carol Adams is the president and CEO of the DuSable Museum of African American History. She reminds us at each of the events, the ones that I've been to for fundraising and so on, why it's important to support our institutions, how they bring artists and historians and educators together. She has served earlier in her career as director of the Center for Inner City Studies, African American Studies, Chicago Housing Authority, and International House of Blues Foundation. I would like to introduce Cecilia Conrad at the end of our panel. She's a PhD economist who's vice president of the MacArthur Fellows Program. And she has just announced the MacArthur Fellows Awards for this year. And we're excited to have seen that list. And amongst them, Asia, who has done so much on labor economics, Asian group. So, and earlier, professor and administrator at Sonoma College, Claremont, California, and also as vice president and dean of the faculty at Scripps. She served as a board member of the Committee on the Status of Women in the Economics Profession. She's an author of African Americans in the U.S. Economy, and she's currently working on a project to explore the influence of feminist economics on U.S. public policy. Marjorie Jolles, my immediate left, is a PhD in philosophy. She's an associate professor and acting director of Women's and Gender Studies at Roosevelt University. She's the co-editor of Fashion Talks, Undressing the Power of Style. And she says that in her life off campus, which we're not really allowed to have. She leads seminars for the Newberry Library Teachers Consortium, gives readings at Women and Children First Bookstore, and volunteers at Chicago Books to Women in Prison. She works with a feminist collective that distributes books to incarcerated women throughout the U.S., and we welcome her. Deborah Siegel. She's a PhD expert on gender politics and the unfinished business of feminists across generations, and I love that phrase, the unfinished business. She's a writer and strategic collaborator. She's the author of Sisterhood Interrupted, From Radical Women to Girls Gone Wild. She's the co-editor of the literary anthology Only Child, founder of the blog Girl with Pen, and co-founder of both the web journal The Scholar and Feminist Online and the website She Writes. She currently works as a Midwest leader of the op-ed project, a social venture designed to broaden the range of voices we hear from the world, with an immediate focus on increasing the volume of women thought leaders in the public sphere to a tipping point. Jill Tietjen. Jill and I have been together all day since 7:30 this morning. Visiting IIT, visiting Shimer College. It's wonderful to work with Jill, who is the president of our national board of the Women's Hall of Fame, as we're moving into the next chapter, refurbishing an historic building in Seneca Falls, a knitting mill, where the owners were abolitionists. They never used cotton. They were also signers of the Declaration of Sentiments. So we feel that it's a really good place for the National Women's Hall of Fame to move to for its new location and education center. She's an author, speaker, and electrical engineer. Her published books include Setting the Record Straight series, which explores the history of women's accomplishments in accounting, engineering, and professional achievement. And she writes introductions to engineering textbooks. I have to admire that. Keys to Engineering Success. She's one of the top historians in the country on scientific and technical women. She's the CEO of Technically Speaking, a national consulting company specializing in improving opportunities for women and girls to have more career options in technology. And her published book, co-authored with a colleague of hers, is called Her Story, A Timeline of Women Who Changed America. In 2010, she was inducted into the Colorado Women's Hall of Fame. These are our panelists. Please welcome them. Okay, and so the first small question for our panelists, who lead, work at, develop, raise funds for, teach at, reach out from, network from these different institutions. The question really is then, how do they envision the term equality? What does it encompass? And I will give each of them a brief period of time to answer that small question, and then we'll move on. You may begin in any order.
Okay,
Cecilia.
I actually struggle with the terms equality and liberation, and as I try to think about why I struggled with them, I realized that neither one of them fully captured the kind of project that I've been engaged in. Can you hear me? Is that okay? Engaged in as someone who is an economist, someone self-identified as a feminist economist who does research on race and gender and economic status. And as I thought about that, I realized that the framework that I embrace overlaps with these notions of equality and liberation, but isn't quite the same. And that framework is the capabilities framework. I am interested fundamentally in human well-being, and I am interested in the freedom to achieve well-being as one of the utmost concerns, and that the freedom to achieve well-being needs to be understood in terms of the capabilities of individuals, what real opportunities they have, and what opportunities they have to do the things that they value doing, that they put an emphasis on and a value doing. And that is my concept of liberation. Now, equality of opportunity is an important element of that. And this includes equal protection under the law, which was so much a focus in the early days of the women's movement. But it isn't sufficient. And it also includes some recognition that equality under the law may not create equality of opportunity based on the historical circumstances and the specific status of those individuals. And it also includes something that in my new role as the leader of a program that focuses on creativity, something I've been very interested in, and that is the notion of the opportunity to take risk, fail, and start over again. The opportunity to rebound. And one of the things that I'm finding as I look at the landscape right now is that there are some achievements. There's the ability for people who've done everything right to, in some sense, reach the top, to reach the pinnacle, to reach success. But for the people who have made mistakes, or had bad luck, or had something not go their way, if you are female, if you are a person of color, if you are black and female, the punishment for those mistakes is not equal compared to those who are largely white European males in power positions. And so in my mind, the big part of equality of opportunity would be getting to a world where there's some equality of rebounding opportunities as well. I'll stop there.
Well, when I thought about this, and your quote at the beginning from Eleanor Roosevelt sort of gets me into this, who said that we were all born free and equal, and I'm not sure when that was. Because if free means, the right to have self-agency, And if equal means that you have the same rights, then we didn't have it when she said it, and we don't have it now. I also thought about equality as something that would require me to admit to some superiority on the part of the dominance to which people are supposed to strive to be equal to. And I always claim some moral superiority to that. So I wasn't striving for that. In fact, I felt part of my sense of self was to think I was better than those who were oppressing me. So my goal was not to get there. I think liberation is when you are free from oppression, when you can, have those rebound opportunities that you spoke of, when you can pursue without encumbrance, without any unfair encumbrances, really where you want to be and where you want to go. And I don't want us to forget that, and I don't want us to lapse into the language of the oppressor when we describe our struggle, which is ongoing. I would submit that we haven't won, we're just closer to winning than we were before we started fighting. And then we have to keep on fighting all the time, because the moment you think you've won, you're going to be losing ground. That whatever you fought for, you have to fight to keep. And we see this evidence constantly as there are attempts to roll back all of those things that we think we have achieved.
I'll chime in. When I think about equality, I think like a philosopher, I think about definitions, and equality describes a relation. So equal to what? Equal to whom? To say something's equal implies a comparative other, a reference. Okay, so women's equality, does that mean equal to men? I think that's what we mean when we use that shorthand, women's equality. I think that's implied, but which men? And what I think it also suggests is that whatever it is we want to be equal to does not need to be examined. So whatever it is that we want to achieve sameness with or equality with is great, and it's kind of unquestioned. And whatever that is stands as the standard that we then, this idea of aspiring to that, is just kind of implied in the concept. And so what we miss, I think, is an examination of whatever it is we want to be equal to, and a moment to reflect on, is that a sameness we want? And it certainly misses, or it prevents us from seeing the unfreedoms in whatever it is we claim to want to be equal to. And so there's a failure, my students will understand, there's a failure of intersectional thinking right then to just posit some sort of mythical free man that is the standard that we're seeking equality to. So I find it to be a limiting rhetoric. And I say that from a position of having a lot of protections. We were just talking before the panel about it's easy to criticize equality when you have it. I don't think I have it, but I have protections that could be taken away. So I'm conscious of sounding too critical of equality, but my criticism stands.
I'll follow the philosopher. As a student of narrative, I feel like I can't see everybody. My work has been around popular representations of feminism and what it means and what it's fighting for. So I think about these questions, and I've continue to live them. My current project is looking at the same movement as it intersects with the history and the current practice of gender equitable child rearing practices. I have boy-girl twins who just turned 5. So my vision of equality is very personal in that I have a little petri dish in my home. But in concert with my writing life, in my professional consulting work, I'm concerned with another layer of representation and these questions of equality. I help other women and other underrepresented experts forge a bridge to having a more public voice. And there's a line in the Declaration of Sentiments which Betty graciously sent to us and bade us reread, which was a very, inspiring exercise, where they talk about misconception and misrepresentation of the cause. And they also talk about using the press and every other mode that I'm sure we'll get to enlist, an audience on our behalf, on behalf of our cause. So in the work that I do, the way that I think about equality and liberation is in looking at the press and in women's and other underrepresented voices' presence or absence on the page. And I see the press not just as a site of employ, as they talk about it in the Declaration, but as a site for disruption itself and as a scene for intervention. So my vision for equality is one where women are not just, and our truths, and all underrepresented populations and truths are not just visible, but where women in particular as beings are powerful in newsrooms and behind the cameras and online and in print and on film as makers and decision makers as well behind the scenes. And I think that many of the initiatives that I'm currently involved in all believe that voices change worldviews, and that voices should be multiple and varied and not just representative of the already privileged and already heard few. Some of the organizations that I work with are looking at bean counting, at looking at equality as, counting how many bylines, how many pieces in print. And some of them are disrupting the very notion of what an expert is and who gets heard. So even as the author of this book called Sisterhood Interrupted, I actually have to resound in on an optimistic note, because many of the initiatives that I've been involved in that are doing this work on the, for representation and transformation through the page are having actual success that's more than a slouch. And we can talk about that. But I'm thrilled to be here and to be having this debate.
Thank you. My perspective is a little bit different than some of the other panelists, having been in corporate America for my entire career as an electrical engineer. And I entered the University of Virginia in the fall of 1972, the third year that women were admitted to the University of Virginia as undergraduate students under court order. I didn't know there weren't women in engineering. There weren't women at the University of Virginia. And so I didn't know until after I graduated that this was an unusual career choice. I've spent my career pretty much as the one, most of the time truly the only, and have seen that we do need, in my belief, additional women in this field. We were actually having a discussion at dinner today. Why do we need women in engineering? Why do we need women in these fields? Has anyone in here ever worn a lavalier microphone? If you have, you know that it was not designed for women's clothing. The original minivan had a sliding door on the passenger side. Where do we need the sliding door? If you're driving a minivan, that would be on the driver's side. Trying to put your kids in the car and trying to put your groceries in the car and your soccer equipment in the car. The original Palm Pilot was designed to fit in a breast pocket. There are not too many of us that have that, women, that is. And so I think that, to me, equality means, in engineering, that women's voice is heard, is honored, is recognized, is incorporated. And then in my role as president of the board of the National Women's Hall of Fame, it's very important to tell women's stories. The statistics are that history textbooks in the U.S. are about 95 to 99% male. That means that we don't learn about women in history except for Pocahontas, Martha Washington, Dolly Madison, Betsy Ross, maybe a few others. College students can't name 20 American women through history that weren't first ladies, celebrities, or sports figures. We don't have that lexicon. We don't have that information. We aren't available to have that validation that comes from telling women's stories. And until we do tell women's stories, and until we recognize and value women in our society, then we're not going to be a free and equal society.
Well, let me bring this a little closer to what you actually do. So we have your visions, and they're complicated, and I like the way they bump up against the conversation that I hear from the mainstream media, which does like to give us statistics out of context, and that's the, I think that's one of the things to grapple with. I like very much how you're talking about a sort of dynamic view of equality, that there should be more narratives about how we can rebound, how equality isn't a static condition, how equality may not actually allow us to talk about our agency or to talk about whose equality is at stake here, and what would it mean to have equality? Is my project done? Am I baked? And so I'm sort of wondering then two things that I'm going to ask all of you in this dynamic view. What is it that you do in your day-to-day work that enacts a way of a practice of equality and or liberation? Because equality may be an ideal, but it's an ideal that seems to need a vision attached to it from what each one of you is saying. And that vision can't be encapsulated by a quick phrase or term. But we have to really think about, are we making visions, or are we trying to get by, or what do we do in the day-to-day in our worlds where we actually bring some of what we're talking about into action? Who wants to jump in?
Okay. So one of the initiatives I work with is the Op-Ed Project, as Betty mentioned, which is a social venture designed to diversify the range of who we hear from in public debate. And what we do is target and train women and other underrepresented experts to use the metric of an op-ed to tip the balance. So in terms of what we're doing to slouch towards equality, we are sort of, putting more people in the pool. And when I say before that I feel optimistic, and I'm going to draw on a statistic here, even though I know we're interrogating the use of statistics. We started in 2008, and the tracking that we were doing then about the number of female bylines in some of the nation's top most influential opinion pages in print and online, the number was 15%. And in a period of just 5 years, that number has gone to 21% after having targeted and trained over 10,000 new voices to be submitting. So I see hope and I take heart. And the question of what are we working towards is not just to have the numbers line up, to have the pie more balanced. VITA, which is an organization for women in the literary arts that counts the number of women reviewers on the pages of the New York Times Book Review, and they create these pies. They and others of us who are counting are also working to change, to help people step into their own public thought leadership and to change the way they see the value of their knowledge and expertise, to raise their hand, to transform themselves and hence transform the world. So I think that tension between where does the change and the push take place? Is it in ourselves? Is it in forging alliances within the institutions? Is it in creating new institutions? She Writes Press is another initiative I'm involved in that's creating an alternative press, because more women write books than men, but more men are traditionally published than women are. So those are some of the ways that some of the work we're engaged in is trying to move the bar.
I think what I try to do in my work is practice what I teach and try to interweave it, but also to celebrate difference. I think that often when we start talking about concepts like equality, that we do not celebrate the beauty of difference. This thing does not require everybody to be just alike. That there's in fact something very oppressive about that. And so to recognize differences and be able to use them in a way that gives the benefits of our diversity is, I think, very important in our everyday work. I think the other thing that is important for me is I resist very strongly the tendency of those who are dominant to sort of define our struggle as passé. You know, it's over. Didn't y'all do that?
I know.
You know, are you still talking about that? Did you get that? You know, and will you get over it? You know, so constantly keeping things in the forefront, working on these goals, reminding ourselves and others that they still are worthy goals, but that I don't see women's equality being trying to be like men. So I just think
In your everyday. Or you, anyone, jump in.
Well, I think about my everyday less in terms of the job I'm currently doing, and more so in terms of an overall career as an academic and as in some ways an academic activist. And I'll start with just a story, because you made me think about it. You're talking about your life at the University of Virginia. When I was getting my PhD in economics, there were 2 women in my program. And I remember thinking about it most acutely because I once went into the ladies' room and fainted. And as I fainted and fell on the floor, I thought to myself, I'm going to be here a very long time. But in that graduate program, in my labor economics course, we had a section where we were talking about the rise in divorce. And the professor's discussion of the rise in divorce got very personal when he looked at the 2 of us in the room, and he said, well, the rise in divorce has a lot to do with people like you. And, you know, women going and getting higher education and so on, and that this is part of the issue. Now, you know, this kind of got me riled up, and I'll admit that it's a riling up that I then deliberately suppressed until I could finish my PhD. But later, as I got more established, I returned to this issue and taught a course on gender and the economy. And when I first taught this course, what kind of shocked me was to find out how little attention to economic status of women there was in the economics literature. And I'm going to cite a statistic too, just because it's so startling. If you look between 1950 and 1970, there were roughly 43,000 articles published in economics journals. 70 had anything at all to do with gender. The primary focus of most of what was published was precisely on this labor supply, this concern about women going to work. And I just have to share this quote because I love it. This is from a 1958 article in the Review of Social Economy. This sudden and shocking rise of women power in the workforce of the United States may, if its rate of acceleration continues, have a more ominous effect on our culture and civilization than all the Sputniks the Soviets can ever produce. So there's sort of two parts to the engagement. And the first part was to be involved with others in trying to redress this lack, this paucity of research. First on the gender pay gap, but as a group of us have looked at this, the research agenda has expanded to include beyond the sort of pay gap to thinking about issues such as childbearing, to think about the ways in which we don't value non-market activity such as taking care of children and so on in ways that should be important in thinking about overall economic well-being. One of my favorite articles in the journal Feminist Economics is called Mother's Milk and Coca-Cola. And the premise of it is that if all the women in the world who were nursing stopped nursing and fed their babies Coca-Cola instead, gross domestic product goes up. Because Coca-Cola counts and breast milk doesn't. I mean, just to kind of give you. So there's a whole series of kinds of questions that were important to begin to interrogate. Part and parcel with that is also increasing participation, and so my involvement with the Committee on the Status of Women in the Economics Profession, I've also been involved in a project to increase minority PhDs in economics, all of that game towards getting different voices involved. It's worth noting that those different voices sometimes come up with very competing analyses of what the problem is. And in the project that I've been engaged in doing this look at the impact of feminist economics on policymaking, one of the more sometimes entertaining, sometimes painful parts of it is going through congressional testimony where they'll bring in dueling economists, and they're usually both women. And one of them says that the problem is that there's discrimination in the market, the problem is that there's not enough social support for women with children, and the other one says, no, women have preferences that lead them to take low-paying jobs. That's not quite what they say, but I've summarized it in a very short way. So the sort of second part of this, so that is an important part of the project, is increasing representation and increasing the research. The second part is actually, and this I connect with your op-ed, is getting the voices heard. Because once you've done the research, there's the important part of communicating it, engaging with the policy audiences, of testifying at legislative hearings, at writing, at being involved in think tanks. There's a MacArthur Fellow, Heidi Hartman, who's an early feminist economist who founded an organization called the Institute for Women's Policy Research that is producing research relevant to policy that particularly looks at what the impact is on women and getting that out there, getting those issues out there. So, for example, the whole focus on paid sick leave as something that should be part and parcel of employment comes out of that Institute for Women's Policy Research. They've also succeeded in redefining the minimum wage as a feminist issue. And so those kinds of aspects of engagement are the sort of second part, that it's not enough to stay in the ivory tower. You kind of have to get out and talk, make some noise.
Okay, and Jill, I'm going to ask you to start on this next question. Because I'm going to move us along, because you've all spoken very nicely about representation, about bringing our voices in, about difference, about keeping our goals at the forefront, and so on and so forth. But one of the things, and I'm not against statistics, but I'm playing the devil's advocate here and enjoying this immensely, I must say. So let me just also say that one of the things with statistics, if you start to count things, and we've done this in the meetings that I went to from the time that I was a graduate student, we used to count not just how many women were in the audience, but what were the topics, and what topics were women talking about. Were they always just talking about certain topics? Is there a way in which we're required as women to speak on certain topics? And whether we're, mothers, whether we're straight, whether we're gay, whether we're, women of color, we're kind of asked and expected to speak on certain topics, even within our own professions. So one of the things with representation and research, I want to ask about how much are we sort of contained and kept within a certain framework. That's one thing. And the second thing, even though I do understand the importance of counting, is there a way in which that is a kind of one-off measure of how are we doing? What's our livelihood like? How are we living together? Because it seems to me to sort of say, well, we have one woman president or a gay president, and then we sort of say, well, that's kind of like, okay, done. We don't talk about succession. And succession, to me, is history making. So how do we ensure in the work, and I'm going to put this back to you, in the work that you do every day, how do you ensure that what you're doing brings someone on board to build the next moment?